Welcome back to Deprogram. This is the NCF show where we do our best to fight back against the forces of ideological conformity, especially among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a fellow at the New Culture Forum, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, a contributor to Courage Media, and our special guest this week, Josh Ferme, there he is, hello, the psychologist and much-loved Lotus Eaters presenter. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you very much.
It's a privilege to have you. Now, I thought we'd start with some the attitudes of the Zoomers. The Times published some alarming figures recently about the political and indeed cultural attitudes of young people. I'll just reel off a couple of them. Only 41% proud to be British, 48% aged 18 to 27 think Britain is an irredeemably racist country, and only 11% would fight for Britain, with 41% of them saying that there are no circumstances whatsoever in which they would take up arms for this country. What do you think is causing this collapse in sentiment among the Zoomers?
So first and foremost, I would like to put forward a word of caution for these sorts of polls, because although I can sort of forecast the direction you're going to go with these, many of those questions I'd probably side with the majority here, right? And so it depends what you have in mind. And I think with such open-ended questions, you're going to get a plethora of different responses. And so as well as the questions about how they're asked, quite often these methodological intricacies in a lot of these political polling polls, I suppose you can call them, are done by people who aren't the most well-versed in psychometrics and things like that, how to objectively measure these things.
To say the least, yes.
And so I think that to take them at face value is not really surprising. When times are hard, people don't necessarily feel overwhelmingly patriotic. If things were going far better, perhaps, this is a very superficial reading of it, then people would be more willing to take, part in these things. And I think that there's also the notion of there's not really any existential threat. And so people saying, well, are you willing to fight for Britain? I would wonder, say, in the interwar period, if you asked people then, perhaps it would be slightly higher. However, I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't as much change as you would expect.
Do you want to say go on?
Yeah, I was going to say that I feel like this is partially the two TV screens phenomena. They're putting out the same message but being received by very different audiences. You mentioned the interwar period. There's, of course, that famous Oxford Union debate.
Yes, this house would not take up arms for king and country.
Exactly, and then very quickly changed when the war was declared. But I think in this case, as you've alluded to, which Zoomers were they asking? Because I don't think we get an ethnic breakdown as to which ones were saying, I will not fight for this country. Because many of them, as we've seen from just random Vox Pop videos with sort of second generation or third generation Nigerians, they don't feel this is their country. They feel that their parents' country, which they might not have even set foot in, is truly their country. Therefore, why would they fight for Britain?
Indeed.
The same goes for, do you think Britain is systemically racist? Well, if you asked the half Indian, half Jamaican heritage girl that gave an interview to the Times, and she railed off some US received wisdom platitude about Britain being founded on the backs of enslaved blacks, which, spoiler alert, sub-Saharan Africans did not build Hadrian's Wall, turns out. She would say yes, but also if you asked us, we'd say, yeah, of course, because the Equality Act discriminates against competent, law-abiding, straight white males. So we might agree with the sentiment, but just for different reasons, and I don't think the Times breaks that down.
Indeed, and I think this is the sort of the double crisis that our oikophobic elite has created. As Connor's alluding to, we've imported people, Gen Z being the most diverse, ethnically, racially, religiously diverse generation in British history, who have incredibly shallow roots here. Doesn't mean that they're bad people, but when we're talking about the army, for example, being a member of the armed forces, it's not just a question of whether you're good at fighting. It's also a question of what are you willing to put your life on the line for. And as Connor's saying, it's often going to be other countries. And I think Jess Gill, who's been on this show before, she actually had the wherewithal to go around some of the more diverse neighbourhoods in Britain and say, would you fight for Britain? And interestingly, the very same people who would identify as British when it is expedient for them to do so, when they want to receive all sorts of benefits, when they want to, like Ash Sarkar, they want to try and intimidate and manipulate Matt Goodwin in a BBC Radio 4 interview saying, Matt, do you think I'm English, when she's on record in the past saying, F off, I'm not British, I'm Bengali, all this sort of thing. All of a sudden, when it comes to actually taking up arms for the country in defence of it, flip their identity purely in accordance with personal and political expedience.
So this is a sort of similar phenomenon whereby there are no feminists in a house fire sort of situation, right? Yes. And There's one aspect to this as well that I think the nature of the conflict that people imagine would be in keeping with historic precedent, and that is foreign adventures in distant lands that cause, in many people's opinion and my own, more harm than good.
Yes.
And so that's what people would imagine. Whereas, were it worded as there is an invading army on at the gates, would you defend your island? I think that we would get a lot more responses in favour of that, and I certainly would respond in favour.
No conscription necessary there. On the back of that as well, it's very important to say that the school system plays into this, not just because we've had the paradox of preaching British values, which means a bending of the knee to all imported tribal subcultures while self-effacing your own, but also the only thing that, I was really taught about in history was the American civil rights struggle and the abolition of the death penalty in the 60s in the UK, transatlantic slavery, and the First and Second World Wars, which means that Britain, its empire, and the broader West in general, particularly America as well, you can pin upon them all the ills of the world, and there is an irredeemable racial guilt at either America's founding or just in the milieu of Britain. And so if that is what is being projected out, no wonder we're not inspiring patriotism in the newcomers, but also if that is what we are fighting to project out into the world, we're trying to get Pride Parade celebrated in Tehran or bong Pakistan into democracy. How's Iraq rather than Pakistan? Slip of the tongue. Nobody's particularly interested in doing that. So no, I'm not going to fight to die overseas in some Ukrainian trench on behalf of the pride flag.
You have raised an important point there. That I think the way that the British Empire is taught that it was this extractive force that was out to basically plunder gold and riches, which if you're describing the Spanish, perhaps that might be valid. However, if you then explain, okay, actually it was to facilitate trade and the empire cost us more than we benefited from it, it's sort of like a non sequitur to most people. They don't really understand where you're coming from, even though that's a factually correct statement. And actually, the entire justification for our empire was to promote trade, which in many ways benefited both parties. And you can see, the first railway in Asia was built by the British in India. That wouldn't have existed were it not for us.
In the Victorian age, it arguably took on some sort of high moralistic, idealistic overtones as well. One thinks of people like David Livingstone, who wanted to spread Christianity around Africa, and ironically, he did such an effective job, much more effective job than the Pentagon did of bringing liberal values to Iraq or Afghanistan. Up to the point where now the sort of Episcopalian, the Church of England here, is somewhat embarrassed by the fact that African Christians take the preachings of the Bible rather seriously, and they're actually quite keen to distance themselves from those people and indeed evict them from communion altogether. So that's another ironic development that has taken place. It's interesting that you talk. So let's just focus on, because one thing that is worth saying is that one of the data points was 41%, which strikes me as quite high, saying that there are no circumstances whatsoever, and presumably that would include an invasion of the homeland, and maybe the unassimilated minorities among Gen Z are radically overrepresented in that, I would imagine. But let's think about the host majority members of Gen Z. I think that's all of us three who have deep roots here, and who, if we had a government which wasn't working against our natural sentiments but in accordance with them, would be all too happy to sign up. Because I might even say no at the moment. I wouldn't say no to under the no circumstances one, but I'd be very skeptical of any government adventure which required conscription at the moment. We've seen recruitment go down among the white British majority in this country. Do you see, say, reform? If there was a reform government tomorrow, and a lot of predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly white Zoomers felt as though that they were getting representation in a way that they hadn't hitherto, do you think that we would see that go up? In other words, do you think this is negotiable, or do you think people's demoralization about the state of Britain is pretty hard to recover from at this point?
I'd like to say I agree with your sort of read of the situation there, and I think that part of the problem seems to be that people just don't have that many examples to call to mind of where there is an existential threat to Britain. And so they might say in a poll that they wouldn't do it under any circumstances, but if everyone and everything they knew and loved was under threat, perhaps they would reconsider. And I think that that's a very significant thing for people to bear in mind. And I think that when the reality was actually upon them, there would be a bit of a difference there. But I also think that, as you were alluding to, there's not much to fight for in the first place. And so were there, a promising future, perhaps people would be more inclined, because it gives you a feeling that you're actually fighting to defend something worthwhile. And at the minute, modern Britain is very difficult to defend in all meanings of the word.
Yes, indeed. I might fight for Britain, but not for UK, as it's increasingly being called.
Yeah, spelled Y-O-O-K-A-Y for our viewers who don't read the Byline Times and get a lot of kind of references. Exactly. What's important to point out as well is not just the stake in the feeling that your own government is on your side, because at the moment it's very much not. And we're talking about invasion here. I mean, one is currently happening every day with the English Channel, and it's fair to depict it this way because the story that I sent to GB News a couple of years ago that the Home Office was very aware of and didn't take action of is that North African people trafficking gangs use videos of girls recorded without their knowledge or consent when they're drunken on a night out to market their services to prospective illegal immigrants who see them as the spoils of war. So they themselves see themselves as some sort of conquering adventurer, like a third world Viking invader. So it's fair to call that an invasion. But if you ever try to stop that, you're criminalized for your speech. Meanwhile, if, for example, the Americans were to come over, I think we'd welcome them as liberators at this point if they were trying to get rid of Stalin's regime. But the other point that Josh has made in general is, what stake do we have in our civilization at the moment? I mean, I'm not trying to turn this into my own kind of middle-class Times column where I complain about the price of eggs, but I've been trying to get a house for the last couple of months and trying to negotiate it, and just the costs and the legal loopholes you have to jump through in order to procure your mortgage and liaise with the solicitors and get the onward chain done, move your broadband, try and get a phone contract under your own name and deal with outsourced customer service in India. Meanwhile, you rock up on the shores of the Channel, you're given one, you're given free bed and board at our expense, and we just seem to be battery farming foreign criminals ad infinitum. So what stake do we have in wanting to fight to preserve the existing order if that's how the question's framed?
I think there is also an element of, as a somewhat young person at 29, I'm clinging on to my youth. My experience of life in Britain is simply that other than my friends and family, no one has been there to help me advance my life in any way. And in fact, the government and many of the systems that exist actively penalise me for who I am by birth. And so there's a certain amount of spite I feel towards the people who have done this to me. And I imagine that although they might not be as self-aware, the concept of wider society, you've got yourself, you've got your friends and family, you're sort of in a circle, they're knowable. But the outside world, all of Britain may have been tinged with this certain systematic cruelty, I suppose I could call it, where it makes people have the perception that, well, people are out to get me, and therefore, what do I owe to other people? Whereas, actually, I think the reality is less so. It's just that we have poorly designed systems in place that make people feel like they're being more persecuted than people actually want them to be.
And the natural end of government in some way has been completely inverted. Rather than securing ordered freedom for people, we get anarcho-tyranny. Rather than representing the people, you import new client groups and represent those client groups against the people. When we've seen, I would say with Starmer, we've seen an escalation of client politics, not least because he depends on these people for votes in the way that the Tories never did. The Tories were usually just too scared to upset minorities, and which is why... Whereas Starmer actively wants to hold on to them, 80% of people vote. 80% of minorities in this country vote Labour at elections, though of course the sort of Muslim independents are increasingly challenging that that Labour hold.
Hence the Islamic Blasphemy Council that Angela Rayner is proposing to set up, with the head of Leeds Mosque being one of the members, who happens to be a trustee of Hope Not Hate, it turns out. Yeah, who formulated the Islamophobia definition in the first place.
Who could have believed it? And so on this point, because I think we might disagree about this, or maybe it's just a question of semantics. I think, do you still identify as a libertarian, Josh, in some sense?
In some ways,
yes.
Although what people normally have in mind is probably not.
Yeah, you're not a swivel-eyed metrosexual or anything like that.
No, he's not working at the IEA.
Yeah, right. So, but I think, do you think that this is an opportunity we've missed a little, in that if the right is only about just cutting taxes and getting out of the way, then I don't find that very inspiring. But given that we have a state which is already in our way, in so many different ways, and say take America for instance as just an illustrative case. We've seen Elon Musk, as part of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, basically taking a chainsaw, Javier Milei style, to USAID in particular, which is effectively the American left's incredibly deep-pocketed patronage network. It's spreading its tentacles all around the world, funding all sorts of guff, from transgender shows in Colombia to DEI in Serbia, and of course a lot in America itself as well. And he's just taken an unapologetic chainsaw to this and cut it all out. And that achieves both things. It's fiscally sensible in the way that libertarians would angle for in so many different ways. So you can kind of get the libertarian instincts and intuitions on board, but it's also an incredibly patriotic thing to do, because it's emblematic of a renewal of confidence in America, rather than just viewing America as this sort of pathologically altruistic empire that expires, that exports decline and entropy and degeneracy all over the world. Do you think that this is an opportunity that libertarians have missed in realizing that this is a possible formulation? In other words, mixing patriotic restorationism, as we might call it, with fiscal good sense, which all good libertarians like.
I think it depends on which side of the Atlantic you're on. I think in the United States, although the scale globally of the USA program is obviously much, much larger than our own, because they have much more money than we have. But I imagine per capita, the rot runs deeper in Britain than it would in the United States, and therefore I think the US is more redeemable. I feel like for the state of play in Britain, actually, the apparatus of government would be useful to remain quite powerful to sort of sort out the problems that exist before then reducing the power of the state, I think. And in the United States, I think they're in a better position to start reducing it already. And I think it very much depends on the political situation. But I think that America has always been better at galvanizing patriotism, and I think that they've got a more patriotic culture more generally, even just organically, than you might have in, say, Britain. And it's quite easy when the Americans have a much higher quality of life compared to European countries to get people to think about things in that sort of way as well.
Go on.
I would say I agree with you. My time in DC in particular after the inauguration, where everyone's just walking around in MAGA paraphernalia, I think because of the latent levels of patriotism that English settlers particularly exported over there, de Tocqueville's written about this, of how the Constitution was only made self-evident because of all of the English civic associations that were set up around the country that could become little pockets of patriotism in the far-off remote corners of the frontier. Overnight, suddenly they switched into MAGA mode, and it was almost like it was activated like a national permission slip. Whereas over here, I mean, we've got the farmers' protest outside as we're filming at the moment. It's nice, it's good, but there's also a kind of ashamedness when you see displays of that. You don't get the same thing of like a boat convoy or truck convoy for Trump rolling through the cities. I wanted to pick up on that particularly, something that you'd said. Libertarianism in terms of economics, I wholeheartedly agree with, just because I don't want to pay much tax, and I do think it's theft, particularly where we see where it's being spent on. However, I do think, and this might be a generational divide, I do think that when the likes of Reform, who are at the top of the polls right now, there's a YouGov Sky poll, they're beating the Conservatives in all major polls. I do think that when they speak about cutting business rates and unleashing the stock market, bringing us back to sort of 1980s style economic prosperity, where lots of the MPs as city boy traders made their money, fine, happy with it. I'll be happy to see that result. But it sort of washes over me like a wave if you're going to campaign on that. I think the generational, cultural, demographic politics are much more salient for us for the reasons that we've been talking about, because we've been to school with it, because we've had it browbeaten into us. And at the moment, I don't know if that is being, other than a few fan cams retweeted by Rupert Lowe, which are very amusing, I don't know if that's being necessarily represented to get the Zoomers on side as much as they clearly would like to. And I think they have the potential to. So do you think they're doing enough to tap into that?
I think that they need to rely on more bread and butter politics. They need to read the sort of mood of the nation what they should be talking about is very cut and dry things that have always been popular in times of decline, like cleaning up the streets in every meaning of the word, both in a literal sense and in a sense of just making them safer. That is of concern now, and I think we all know the reasons for this. And obviously, it's beating a dead horse to go over it again. Things like that need to be hammered home. Just, do you want to feel safe at night walking home? Do you want things to be neat and tidy? Do you want people to be talking on speakerphone on public transport? These sorts of things are things that bother people in daily life, aren't they? And so appealing to these sorts of things, I think writing policies that, as you've described, that might appeal to me, but I will admit I'm not the average person. And usually I think normal people don't think about, cutting business rates and that sort of thing. They want to see tangible improvements in their own life. And this is true of all politicians. That a lot of the time they're trying to court the people around them rather than the person who exists in abstraction from their own experience.
Well, the thing is, this is where, in democratic politics, what you want to do is, it's not so much a question of doing straw polls and finding out where people approximately stand on certain issues when asked. You want to try and make the issues that are strong for you more salient. And if you can tie them to this, I think this is the promise of mixing a certain amount of economic liberalism structured by deep, larger questions than just making money, but a certain amount of economic liberalism with cultural and demographic concerns around immigration and indeed fiscal conservatism, mixing those together. So saying things like, look at the palpable, the bread and butter issues. Look at the palpable decline of public services. Meanwhile, we have 12,000 foreign nationals in our prisons, and probably more if we account for we throw dual nationals in as well as foreign nationals or nationals who are eligible for citizenship elsewhere, even if they haven't claimed it yet. People like Shamima Begum, for instance, who is a British citizen but was eligible for citizenship in Bangladesh and therefore could be, at the discretion of the Home Secretary, have her citizenship taken away. You can talk about things like that. You can talk about why is it that young people are struggling to get a home and then name another important
Somalians in Britain are in social
housing. So you can mix these things together, and I don't, with the exception of Rupert Lowe at the moment, and obviously things can change, that isn't really being done.
I think Farage is starting to do this a little bit more. What was encouraging is that perhaps we want to take credit for the nudging, but I think President Trump's victory, particularly with young men who said, when polled, as Rafe keeps citing, that they would, in the UK, sooner vote for Trump than Farage himself.
The British voted.
Yeah,
British Zoomers, yeah.
Yes, quite. And also American Zoomers, Trump is very popular. When Trump has made mass deportations possible, because he's set Bulldog Tom Homan to do it, and he's now strong-arming the exoteric global American empire's influence in Latin American countries to make them take the foreign criminals back. Farage then did a down camera video saying, look, our countries are different, but the principle is the same. If you're in Britain illegally, you have to go home.
Yeah.
And it felt like, even though he didn't address the change from saying we can't do mass deportations,
it had been made nonetheless.
He understands there's now more room in the Overton window for it to be safe. And so he's now trying to move to occupy that, which is encouraging.
That is good, but what I mean is something a bit more specific, namely reform MPs profitably mixing their economically liberal instincts, which they all have, particularly Tyson Lowe, but Farage too. He dealt in precious metals in the city in the 1980s. They're all sort of attached to that kind of pinstriped yuppie culture. They clearly are, and it's not everyone's a creature of their own time. Not attacking them on that ground. But one of the problems with that Thatcher right period is that, and this is a slightly pompous point, but I think it's a good one. People lost sight of the meaning of an economy. Like if you go back to ancient Greek, an economy basically meant the rules of the household meaning oikos and nomos meaning sort of rules. And you need to actually have a home. You need to have an oikos before you can discuss the rules that make for its material flourishing. And when all you're doing is obsessing over the abstractions that in principle can make a place flourish, you lose sight of the home itself. And as the home is collapsing all around you, you're talking about how we can save the West by cutting capital gains tax. Well, you got all the Nigerians and Pakistanis and all of these other sort of incredibly bewildering and disrupting influences coming in at sight and just completely obliterating any sense of home whatsoever. And so if you can find a way of profitably mixing economically liberal sentiments with immigration and with the bread and butter concerns to which immigration is relevant, that seems to me to be a cocktail that can both attract the telegraph class that is attracted to the Thatcherite talking points and young Zoomers who feel dispossessed.
I very much agree, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's all that needs to be said there. Trump and Musk are also looking to set to. It's very interesting that they've been doing this recently to throw American muscle around, not just in the interest of American citizens. So we've seen them do it in Colombia and elsewhere in Latin America and well, sort of Canada, although some people may disagree with that given our natural affinity with Canada.
Well, the Canadians, not the hundreds of thousands of Indians that keep occupying.
This is true. This is true. But on behalf of, he's also been promoting otherwise very unpopular interest groups like the whites of South Africa, who are due to be subjected to further persecution by the black majority there. I should say that it's always very frustrating to me that left-wing folklore always romanticizes these revolutions, whether it's the sort of Zimbabwean revolution against the former Rhodesia, or whether it's the Haitian revolution against the French, and indeed the what happened in South Africa in the 1990s, but never really sort of checking how things are going on 30 years later, or in the case of Haiti, 250 years later. But it does seem as though the whites are particularly up against it in South Africa. And you did, I must say, a very excellent segment on this, which everyone should have a look at for Lotus Eaters recently. But in case they should stay here first for you to explain roughly what's going on in South Africa and and why we should be encouraged by what Musk and Trump have been saying about it, because these are not a very popular minority group. Let's put it that way.
Yes. So what I think is actually going on is the ANC, which is the party of Nelson Mandela, and who carried out the revolution, so to speak. And they've been the majority party. They've had an electoral majority since 1994. And as of the recent election, they lost that majority. And so what they're doing is to stop the bleed leftwards. They're already quite left-wing. What they're trying to do is present themselves as being quite strong rhetorically and perhaps practically as well.
So just for people, so their main electoral threat is to their left, namely the more swivel-eyed race communists, not to more sensible people.
It seems like it,
yeah.
And because basically there was a bit of a split between Cyril Ramaphosa and Jacob Zuma, and he set up a party that year that they lost about 14% off the top of my head. I'm remembering election statistics. So I might well be wrong there. But basically, what they're trying to do in expropriating effectively white farmers' land is say, listen, we're the party that can sort you out with farmland. It's sort of pandering to their voter base in another way. But of course, whether it's cynical pandering or not, it's still a very real threat to the white minority there, because of course their farmsteads, their farms are their livelihood, and having it commandeered without compensation is a very scary prospect and a very illiberal one. You don't have property rights if the government can sweep in and take your property that your life depends and give it to someone else because of the colour of their skin, ultimately. And the bitter irony is that the same people that celebrate the ANC will not acknowledge the fact that they're just as guilty of the very same thing that they supposedly overthrew.
Yes, indeed.
Well, it's because they weren't deep down colourblind liberals; they were race communists. I mean, this is the great mythology of Nelson Mandela, who has a statue in Parliament Square, despite his wife endorsing necklacing, which is putting a tie around the neck of her enemies and burning it alive. They were involved with the Soviet Union. They committed numerous bombings, which ended up killing civilians. So they were always on this trajectory. It's just that those at the time who were principally opposed to apartheid because we shouldn't discriminate against people on the colour of their skin, beyond the content of their character, the old Martin Luther King adage, they took them at their word, and they thought that this would just be a new era of cooperative race relations. They didn't realise, as in many of the cases from post-colonial states, that they would the Africans or subcontinentals who were living under British rule would see the British people, or the white South African minority, or the whites in Rhodesia, as collectively responsible for perceived sins of the past. And now the uncomfortable point about this, as you've been covering for a long time, is that the conditions of South Africa have so rapidly deteriorated because of this race communist ideology that now they very rarely have functioning power grids, and they're looking at things like food shortages because they're chasing the productive farmers off, and they've just got roving vans of vigilantes, whether it's because they're hunting down white farmers for the colour of their skin, or you've got groups like Operation Dadula who are hunting down other Africans in their country as illegal migrants, shaking down businesses and acting like a kind of South African racial mafia. So it's not looking good, is it?
I imagine both of you might have seen footage from a documentary of a Chinese, I imagine, Belt and Road worker talking to some of the native Africans.
They did, actually.
Is this Empire of Dust?
It is, yes. And I think that the key thing there is when he articulates to them, listen, they left you all of this great infrastructure. You know, you had railway lines and locomotives before even we did, thanks to colonialism, basically. Why haven't you maintained them? Why haven't you learnt from them? Why can't you maintain civilization when it's been provided to you for effectively free?
Yes.
And he was very frustrated with that. And I think that speaks of something, doesn't it? That they've refused almost, because it's associated with the white man, to maintain all of this infrastructure.
Yes.
Like in South Africa, sometimes they only have electricity for 4 hours a day in some parts, which means that you can't even have like a restaurant or a fridge to keep the food in. So it's failed state territory there.
It goes to show that the part of classical liberal economic theory, which frames man as just a homo economicus, purely interested in enlightened self-interest and all that sort of thing. Clearly, that's an important aspect of the human person. We are self-interested beings, but there are occasions where things like racial spite or racial resentment prevail over the better angels of our nature, or indeed over our better pursuit of self-interest. I mean, South Africa, black South Africans would be better off today if they were not engaging in this kind of racial spite and were in fact making peace with the fact that the most economically productive and developmental and contributory demographic in the country remains the white South Africans, and would just want to defend their property rights, but they make up a huge proportion of the tax base. But of course that hasn't happened. It's also worth saying that this is probably going to get into even more of a tailspin and a spiral here, because if the more that South Africa declines, the less the ANC or the ruling government can point to economic prosperity as the source of its legitimacy. So it's going to have to find a scapegoat, and obviously the obvious scapegoat in sight is going to be the white minority in South Africa. And I would imagine if once and for all the white South Africans do end up leaving, and there's just an increasingly diminished presence of them there, it will then be turned on to other Africans. I have no question that will happen, because there's a lot of tribalism among the black majority, within the black majority, not just between the black majority and the white minority. It's already happening.
It is, yes, because Cyril Ramaphosa is, currently the leader. However, Jacob Zuma is more affiliated with the Zulus. I think, off the top of my head, he might even be ethnically Zulu, and so they represent a tribe within South Africa that is different to some of the others, and there are already tensions there, and you did touch on something that is sort of very close to my level of research expertise, and that is talking about basically behavioral economics. Yeah. And people like to characterize people as these rational human beings who pursue their self-interest and will be economically productive. You could drop them anywhere in the world and they would do so, but that's not how human beings actually behave, and we're far more irrational from an economist's perspective anyway, than often given credit for. And I think that, as you touched on, there are lots and lots of things that can get in the way of pursuing your own economic self-interest. And I think one of the major ones is actually being able to perceive it.
Yes.
I think that one of the major failures of the ANC is they should have, even though it's useful for them politically, they should have at least highlighted to the population, well, actually, some of these farmers are some of the most productive, and we can't just get rid of them because then you won't get food. And I think that no matter how resentful people are, if the alternative is be resentful and carry out some sort of racially motivated justice or eat, people will choose the latter.
Yeah, I also don't wish to scaremonger, but when you say this mentality of, we just drag and drop people from this place to ensure that our GDP graph keeps going up, and it doesn't acknowledge the cultural and civilizational baggage which weighs on people's consciences. I think particularly more so from people outside the liberalized, increasingly secularized West, where we think of ourselves as individuals, whereas other people think of themselves as bearers of their parents' civilization or members of clans and tribes and ummas in the case of the Muslim world. We worry about hitting a sufficient demographic and cultural tipping point that we begin to recreate the conditions of South Africa in this country. And I don't wish to scaremonger, but we're already seeing signs of that in the rhetoric in the trials and transcripts from the grooming gangs, for example, where the families will justify the crimes perpetrated against the girls because they're white, because they're kafar, because they're part of the out-group. But also, it's a strange thing to bring up, but there was a recent interview that people should watch between the gentleman at Trigonometry and Kemi Badenoch. And Kemi Badenoch was saying, look, I don't want the UK to become like Nigeria. I don't want it to become like India. I don't want to play ship of Theseus with the constituent parts of the UK, that the members that make up its home. It's not a hotel, etc. And this is the strongest that she sounded rhetorically, but then she wouldn't be pinned down on what sufficient quantity of people every single year constitutes recreating those conditions of those lands. And it's because I think she's still stuck in the mindset of, if people are incentive driven, then you just need a Goldilocks ratio of enough foreigners standing next to enough Brits, and then they'll assimilate by osmosis because it will just be drip fed into them. That mentality still doesn't account for the fact that people will have these sort of immovable tribal priors, and that if you drag and drop them into this country, they may still see the host majority, increasingly dwindling majority, as perpetrators of injustice against them in their homelands. And so if that population grows to a sufficient amount, I don't want to be alarmist, but we could be looking at, in certain pockets, South Africa-style conditions here.
Can I just say very quick, I think even that, I'd completely agree with that analysis, but I'd put in one rider. I think even that is a slightly too charitable to Kemi's position, because she doesn't even seem to think that foreigners coming here need to be in close proximity to Brits. It's not even that concrete, because people might say with a place like Tower Hamlets, for example, and I've made this point before, if the concept of integration is not just an abstract values-based exercise. There needs to be something concrete, a living culture on the ground, and only people can be the bearer of such a culture. So you need to take immigrants in incredibly small numbers to parts of the country that are already settled cultures, and then that kind of integration by osmosis, again, was provided that the number is small, can, in limited circumstances, take place. But as far as I can tell, Kemi doesn't even think that there needs to be a living, concrete entity on the ground to which people, which acts as a driver of assimilation. She thinks that the whole enterprise can be purely programmatic and values-based. Would you not say that that's her?
I would say that's her rhetoric,
that's her anthropology.
Which is strange, because in her lived experience, she did exactly the kind of low-scale assimilation that you would describe, which is she's married I think he lives in London, but he's Scottish, had mixed-race kids, but even then, she doesn't put her British identity primary, and this isn't us being bigoted or anything. She's been so granular about her identity in the page of The Spectator. She doesn't say that she's a first-generation immigrant. She does in Parliament. She doesn't say, I'm Nigerian. She says, I'm Yoruba. And the rest of Nigeria are my ethnic enemies, as if she's going to unleash Trident on Boko Haram. So if even the leader of the Conservative Party, as assimilated as you can get, still holds her previous identity as prime, even if it doesn't make her see the native population as inferior because she's married to one. What does that mean for people who are less likely to assimilate, less likely to live among the natives, and don't hold us as in high regard as Kemi Badenoch does?
Well, I think that people have a very misguided view on human nature more generally, because the notion of assimilation is normally that someone from a neighbouring tribe who, for all intents and purposes, has a significant amount of genetic overlap. And so that would have been the default throughout most of human history. And this notion that you can take someone from the other side of the world or elsewhere and immediately just drop them in Britain and they become just as British as you or I, is very misguided, because people don't behave like that. And you can even look at non-human primates as an example. There are examples of integration in there, and it's actually very interesting because it mirrors human beings to a very significant degree, in that they'll integrate maybe one or two members in a group of, say, 30 or 40, and that's okay and acceptable. But when it gets to too large a number, it then becomes an existential threat for the group itself, and they stop seeing it as, oh, this is a new potential member who has to prove themselves. And they start seeing it as, there's a rival group in my territory that's coming to take our our resources.
Yes, it becomes not so much assimilation as submergence, and indeed, in the end, if allowed to play out long enough, a form of unarmed conquest, essentially.
Yes,
which is, which is what I view us as living through it.
Yeah, and I think that these sorts of things shouldn't be overlooked because they're so deeply enshrined in our nature, and they were probably essential for our ancestors' survival to a certain extent, that these things are deeply rooted. And I don't think that they can really be truly socialized out of people. I think we can consciously mitigate against them and have the appearance that they're gone, but the instinct will always remain and always influence us to a certain extent because it's so deeply held and deeply rooted.
We should at least recognize that they might be more or less potent based on civilizations, particularly that have practiced the principle of universal moral dignity under Christianity versus the more tribal, factional religions like Islam or Voodoo, etc., in other parts of the world.
Yeah, well, so there was I don't agree with him on everything, but it's a book well worth reading. I can't remember whether it's called Nations and Nationalism or whether it's just called Nationalism, but Ernest Gellner, very, very gifted. I think he was Czech-British Jewish sociologist in the 1980s, wrote a very good book on nationalism where he talks about the concept of assimilation in some depth. And he takes a very concrete view of it, not a values-based view of it. And he talks about all the sort of things you're both talking about. He calls them these sort of counter-entropic tendencies, which make assimilation much, much harder. And he doesn't view language as one because language can be broken down fairly quickly. But he does view religion as the strongest. He views ethnicity as being quite strong, and he talks about ghettoization as well. And when you have a situation where in certain pockets of the United Kingdom, and Tower Hamlets would be one, Bradford would be one, Rotherham would be one, where there is just nothing left of the host culture anymore, it doesn't really do any good to wheel out hot civics programs. As I've joked before, you can't just drop a copy of John Fortescue through every letterbox in Tower Hamlets and hope that people are going to get the memo. It's not a Platonic exercise in philosophical persuasion. And when people like Kemi Badenoch talk about how every now and then on this kind of assimilationist, integrationist talk, there'll be just these verbal harangues. Well, it's integrated. Go ahead and stand up and sing the national anthem, drape yourself in the flag. But this is all impotent because it is purely abstract, and you cannot expect people who don't even speak English and are living in Tower Hamlets and where Urdu's spoken widely. You just can't expect this to happen. There are too many counter-entropic, as Ernst Gellner would put it, tendencies on the ground which are just counting against assimilation.
Mm-hmm. And there's also perhaps a lower point that people are coming from parts of the world where their education is not necessarily the best, and even with the best one in the world, they might not be able to integrate even if they were trying hard and the conditions were right, just by merit of the fact that the barrier to entry to British culture as a native would exist within it is actually quite high from a global perspective. And it's not the easiest thing to just learn to do, even for other Europeans, let alone people from, Sub-Saharan Africa or Pakistan or India.
What's in practice, what forms of difficulty do you think that takes? Being a bit more specific about that.
Well, just the nature even of the English language itself. We're quite prone, because we've got a politeness culture, to use euphemisms and refer to things subtly and with a sort of deft hand, which seems second nature to most people, and I should hope it is. And to someone from the outside, that's not an easy thing to do.
Yes.
And I think that for some people, they'll never be able to do it in their lifetime. And it's not even that controversial, I don't think.
There's a good literary example that isn't ethnically particular. Think of John the Savage talking to the world controller in Brave New World when he discovered Shakespeare, and it sort of speaks to him as a kind of a wellspring of universal meaning. And he says, well, why have you deprived them of Shakespeare? And he goes, well, even if I made Shakespeare available, we have sufficiently programmed the people that live in Brave New World to not have a frame of reference to even understand it in the first place. So even if you were to post copies of John Fortescue for every single letterbox, and they tried their damnedest to read it and learn English, the words wouldn't resonate. The concepts wouldn't necessarily speak to something that is intuitive to them from their host culture. They'd have no frame of reference to understand it. So it's only for people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who has a very stark and conscious break with their host culture because something dreadful happens to them, and they come over and express gratitude and then marry into the civilization and dedicate their lives to extolling the virtues of their adopted homeland. It's only those people that you can say have sufficiently integrated as friends into our tribe. That barrier to entry is almost impossibly high for the majority of the world who practice cultures that are antithetical to our own?
From the farmers of South Africa to the farmers of this country, we've seen them come out again. We're filming in Westminster today, and they're outside making a noise and protesting against this inheritance tax. Do you think that there is a sinister current to this inheritance tax? Do you think it is to some extent an escalation of client politics on the part of this Starmer government, which is not going to have any electoral luck with farmers, as indeed it's not going to have much electoral luck with people who send their children to private schools? They always seem to raid the coffers of the most enterprising, independent people in this country in order to engage in an effective wealth transfer to the people in the public sector, many of whom are good-for-nothings, who peddle all sorts of divisive ideologies and managerial, hobby horses.
I think it's an alignment of lots of different various interests, all sort of coming together at once for the Labour Party. On the one hand, they get to spitefully punish a group that doesn't vote for them, which I don't think is above the Labour Party, and there is precedent there. Two, Keir Starmer's buddy, Larry Fink at BlackRock, gets to buy up lots of cheap farmland, and I know that they're keen to do so. And I do wonder what the contents of those meetings between Keir Starmer and him were about, because it certainly wasn't about how Larry Fink can model his PR off of Keir Starmer, was it?
Well, our friend Lewis Brackpool put in FOI requests about the contents of the meetings between Fink, Starmer, and Bill Gates as well, and was blocked.
He was rebuffed.
Bill Gates, I believe, the largest landowner in the United States currently.
Is he really?
I've heard that bandied around.
Independent landowner of farmland. I think.
Really? Okay. Yes. Thank you for the clarifying. That was off the top of my head. So I think that there's lots of incentives here because, of course, there's another darker element to it as well that I've been sort of thinking about, that it's the countryside is sort of the life spring of British culture. There might be because I'm from the countryside that I'm saying that. I will concede. However, if you go out into the countryside, into small rural towns, you are reminded of what being British is all about all over again. And I think if you live in a metropolitan city like London or plenty of others now, you forget what it's like to be in a truly British place and how pleasant it is. And having these reminders of what basically a monocultural society is like really undermines the multicultural experiment when it's safe, pleasant, people are friendly, people say hello to each other on the street, even going back home over Christmas.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I had that experience, and we would stop and have a chat with strangers, and everyone was friendly, everyone knew where everyone stood with everything. It was very comfortable. Everyone was just looking to be nice to other people, and that is a very unfortunate truth for someone trying to push forward with what I see as a failed multicultural experiment.
Yeah, when diversity is constantly touted as our strength, and people in the cities can go along with believing that because they don't know much else, going to the countryside will swiftly disabuse them of such fantasies, and will make the idea of a more settled, homogeneous, as you say, monoculture much more attractive.
It's like the inverse of Potemkin Village. It's like when the Potemkin villages were put up, and you'd have all these useful idiot Western journalists trotted around saying this is the promise of communism.
Yes,
you just don't look behind the cardboard cutout to see all the starving Ukrainians. It's quite the inverse. You go to these very real villages, these little pockets of deep England, as Douglas Murray would have put it, and you can see that we actually don't have to live like this. We don't have to live in centrally planned battery farms full of foreign criminals. Like it's entirely a choice. And so they have to strip these away so the native population don't get too resentful about their maltreatment, which they've resisted in every election and referendum since 1974.
It's probably why they're going after, again, there's more of a hive mind than a coordinated effort, but it's probably why they're going after vestiges of English, of this culture as represented in art as well. I mean, I forget whether it was Constable or Gainsborough, some 18th century naturalistic painter who did these lovely landscapes of the English countryside. And I think
it very much sounds like Constable.
I think I think they both did that quite a bit, but I think it was Constable in this case, and it was at was it at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford or I forget where it was exactly, but there was some museum where this was going on, and some awful woke managerial type in the museum itself had put a placard next to Constable saying, "This may evoke dark nationalistic feelings." And in a way, I don't view those feelings as dark at all, but in a sense, they're actually right about that. And to try and discredit that in the eyes of people and to try to demoralize them further It's an important motivation for our political, cultural, and media class, which does survive on the mantra that diversity is some kind of strength.
Yeah, quite the inverse. When you're walking around London, you see portraits of modern Britain, and it's a woman dressed as a ninja hiking through the Cotswolds.
Well, I would argue that was it an art gallery director, I suppose, or whoever put the placard there. They were sort of onto something in a way. I wouldn't necessarily call it dark, but when you think of Britain and England, you think of the land itself and the beauty of it. And I think if you close your eyes and imagine what, British land is like, you imagine all of the aspects of it that are worth saving, which is the beautiful countryside. And it is idyllic. If you've ever spent any amount of time away, particularly, to the hotter climes, and then you fly back over Britain, the greenness is, so saturated, so rich, it's so lush and full of life that you sort of think, well, why did I even go away in the first place?
So it's very particular and unique. This is why you're so good at GeoGuessr. It's almost like if you were clobbered on the head and you woke up like you're at the start of an Elder Scrolls game and looked around and didn't know where you are, and you were in the English countryside, you wouldn't mistake it for anywhere else in the world. And so they need to strip mine out these reminders of our particularity and our potential in order to enforce us to drink multicultural sludge.
Well, given that you are a country bumpkin, we can only thank you for braving the trip to the metropolis today. It's been a privilege, Josh. Thank you
very much for having me.
For joining us on Deprogrammed. Connor, thank you as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and make a comment on the video if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.